Morning to everyone.
Today I am going to start with the new chapter, Working Capital Management. So now, what do you mean by working capital management? Working capital means the capital required for the day-to-day working of the business. Working capital means the capital required for the day-to-day working of the business. And let me now discuss some of the definitions, some of the meaning of what you say working capital. Just wait for 1 minute. Let me So working capital management means, according to Hoagland, he has defined working capital as the difference between the book value of the current assets and the current liabilities. Now, as I told you, working capital is the capital which is required for the day-to-day working of the business. Now, as the name itself says, that working capital for the business to function properly, for the business to run, the capital which is required is known as the working capital. So now, according to Hoagland, working capital is the difference between the book value means the balance sheet value of current asset and current liability. Means when you, from the current asset, when you minus the current liability, you get the working capital. करंट असेट से जब हम करंट लाइबिलिटी माइनस करते हैं तब हमें मिलता है वर्किंग कैपिटल. Now you will say, what is current asset and what is current liability? So the assets which are there with the business for a short period of time, that is cash balance, that is the debtors, matlab the moving assets, the circulating assets, the assets which changes, the assets which are there with the business for shorter period of time is known as current asset. Means cash is very liquid. आज हमारे पास पैसा है तो कल वो रहेगा. We can't assure debtors. इनसे हमने, these are our customers who we have sold goods on credit. मतलब इनको हमने उधार में पैसे गुड्स बेचा है तो ये लोग उधार चुका देंगे आज नहीं तो कल. मींस these are those assets which are there in the business for shorter period of time. There are two type of assets, current asset and fixed assets. So fixed assets are those assets which are there in the business for longer period of time. तो हम लोग जब working capital की बात करते हैं, that time we do not consider the long term assets. We consider only the short term assets. The short term assets means the current asset. The difference between current asset and the current liability. Current liability are the liabilities which are in the business for shorter period of time. Like for example, our suppliers, our creditors, इनसे हमने goods खरीदा है उधार पे, क्रेडिट पे, तो हम इनको टाइम टू टाइम इनका पैसा चुकाएंगे. तो these are the liabilities which are there in the business for shorter period of time. For example, less than a year. So these, the difference between current asset and current liability is working capital. तो हमें अगर working capital, the capital required for the working of the business अगर हमें चाहिए, तो how will we find out? By minusing, by deducting from the current assets the current liabilities. मतलब current assets से जब current liability minus करते हैं, we get the working capital. Now, according to Accounting Principles Board of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, They have defined working capital as the excess of current asset over current liabilities. One and the same thing. मतलब current asset current liability से जितना ज्यादा है वो excess amount is known as the working capital. This is that liquid portion of the total capital. Liquid means that can be easily converted into cash of the current capital, of the total capital, a margin or buffer for liabilities payable within the ordinary operating cycle. Operating cycle, the business cycle, that is the cycle, that is the period. Operating cycle क्या होता है? This is the period which is required for the, this is the period from the purchase, from the first stage of purchase of goods to the final stage of the receipt of the money through sales. Operating cycle of business मतलब क्या? मतलब डे 1 से लेके डे एक्स जो जरूरी है, मतलब आज मैंने बिजनेस में रॉ मटेरियल खरीदा से लेके वो रॉ मटेरियल को बेच के जो मुझे कैश आता है, दैट होल साइकिल इज नोन एज द ऑपरेटिंग साइकिल ऑफ द बिजनेस. तो वो साइकिल में जितना करंट असेट एंड करंट लाइबिलिटी का जरूरत हुआ, दैट इज करंट असेट में से हम क्या पे करते हैं, करंट लाइबिलिटी माइनस करते हैं, दैट यू गेट द वर्किंग कैपिटल. इन शॉर्ट, वर्किंग कैपिटल इज व्हाट? Current asset minus current liability. Current asset minus current liability. So now let us go to the next slide. Let us see the types of working capital. Let us see the types of working capital. The first type is known as gross and net working capital. इसमें दो है, एक होता है gross working capital और दूसरा होता है नेट वर्किंग कैपिटल. अब दोनों के बीच में व्हाट इज द डिफरेंस? ग्रॉस वर्किंग कैपिटल मींस करंट असेट. ग्रॉस वर्किंग कैपिटल मींस करंट असेट. सी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, अगर क्वेश्चन में आया व्हाट इज ग्रॉस वर्किंग कैपिटल, तो ग्रॉस वर्किंग कैपिटल मींस करंट असेट. करंट असेट को ही हम बोलते हैं ग्रॉस वर्किंग कैपिटल. मतलब ये वो करंट असेट है इसमें से अभी तक करंट लाइबिलिटी माइनस नहीं हुआ. तो ग्रॉस वर्किंग कैपिटल मींस नथिंग बट करंट असेट. देन व्हाट इज नेट वर्किंग कैपिटल? टू कंसेप्ट है, ग्रॉस एंड नेट वर्किंग कैपिटल. मतलब ग्रॉस वर्किंग कैपिटल and net working capital. I told you gross working capital means current asset. So what is net working capital? Net working capital means current asset minus current liability. Means current asset minus current liability. समझा? Gross working capital मतलब current asset. Net working capital means current asset minus current liability. Current asset minus current liability is equal to net working capital. Now next one, permanent and temporary working capital. So permanent working capital is the minimum amount of working capital required for the running of the business. मतलब इतना कैपिटल तो हमें चाहिए ही है for the running of the business. Means base, इतना minimum capital is always required to run the business. That amount of capital is known as परमानेंट वर्किंग कैपिटल. मतलब बिजनेस चलाने के लिए जितना मिनिमम कैपिटल हमें चाहिए, दैट इज नोन एज परमानेंट वर्किंग कैपिटल. परमानेंट वर्किंग कैपिटल. नॉर्मली permanent working capital is financed by means of permanent sources of finance. मतलब बिजनेस को जो पैसा मिलता है, फाइनेंस मिलता है, टू रन देयर बिजनेस, सच एज शेयर कैपिटल, loans, bank loans, any loan capital such as debentures, bank loans, etc. are used to fund the permanent working capital. Now, what is the temporary working capital? So temporary working capital is also known as fluctuating working capital. Temporary working capital is also known as fluctuating working capital. मतलब ये वो suppose there are certain goods which are required at a certain period of time. मतलब जब भी कुछ पीरियड रहता है, जैसे कि बोलते हैं ना पीक पीरियड, जब भी उसका डिमांड बहुत ज्यादा रहता है, जैसे वी कैन से some particular type of, जैसे for example during festival seasons the requirement for clothes is very high. तो वैसे टाइम पे शॉपकीपर्स क्या करते हैं, they will require more working capital because उनको पता है, जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल स्वीट, अगर अभी नाउ एज दिवाली हैज स्टार्टेड, ये टाइम पे देयर विल बी मोर कंजम्पशन ऑफ स्वीट्स, there will be more demand for sweets, clothes, etc. तो ऐसे टाइम पे the shopkeepers will require more amount of working capital because they have to produce more goods उनको प्रोड्यूस करना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि ये टाइम पे डिमांड बहुत ज्यादा रहता है फॉर clothes, for what you say, for sweets, etc. So that this time some extra amount of working capital will be required. That extra amount of working capital is the temporary working capital because it is only required at the time of at a peak season. मतलब जब peak season रहता है, जब extra excessive demand रहता है, only that time this extra working capital, मतलब उनको business running, उनको ज्यादा goods प्रोड्यूस करना पड़ेगा, तो उनको ज्यादा रॉ मटेरियल चाहिए, तो ये टाइम पे लेबरर भी ज्यादा चाहिए, ये टाइम पे ओवरहेड एक्स्ट्रा कॉस्ट भी ज्यादा रहेगा. तो दीज चीजों के लिए देयर विल बी रिक्वायरमेंट ऑफ एक्स्ट्रा कैपिटल. तो ये temporary working capital is normally financed through temporary sources of finance, that is short-term loans, deposit, bank overdraft, etc. तो इससे हम क्या करते हैं, temporary working capital के लिए finance जमा करते हैं. We fund the temporary working capital because this is not a permanent working capital. This fund will be required only for a short period of time. And suppose for during some particular festivals, etc. Now, next, balance sheet capital and cash working capital. Now, what do you mean by balance sheet capital? Balance sheet capital is actually calculated is on the basis of the balances of current assets and current liabilities as per the closing balance sheet of the concern. मतलब जो बैलेंस शीट क्वेश्चन में दिया है उसमें जो करंट असेट है उसमें से करंट लाइबिलिटीज को माइनस करके जो हम वर्किंग कैपिटल कैलकुलेट करते हैं, दैट इज नोन एज बैलेंस शीट कैपिटल. दैट इज नोन एज बैलेंस शीट कैपिटल. Balance sheet working capital shows the amount of net assets as on the last day of the accounting year of the business. As on the last day of the accounting year of the concern. मतलब ये कैसे निकालते हैं, बैलेंस शीट में जो करंट असेट है उसमें से जो बैलेंस शीट में जो करंट लाइबिलिटी है, करंट असेट में से करंट लाइबिलिटी माइनस किया तो यू विल गेट द बैलेंस शीट वर्किंग कैपिटल. नाउ नेक्स्ट वन इसके साथ है कैश वर्किंग कैपिटल. नाउ व्हाट डू यू मीन बाय कैश वर्किंग कैपिटल? कैश वर्किंग कैपिटल मतलब we will be taking only, मतलब cash working capital indicates the working capital at cash cost, at cash cost, मतलब यहाँ पे हम कुछ भी like for example हम कोई वो जो जैसे फॉर एग्जाम्पल डेटर्स को, डेटर्स मतलब कौन, हमारे कस्टमर्स जिनको कि हमने उधार में, क्रेडिट में सेल किया है, उधार में सेल किया है, एंड नॉर्मली वी वैल्यू द डेटर, मतलब डेटर्स में